It's somewhere around 10,000 BCE, and you're living in a small settlement near the edge of what is now northern Turkey. Life is genuinely hard. You're not romanticizing it. It just is. Winter's bite. Food is uncertain. The people around you are your whole world, and losing one of them means losing a critical piece of what keeps your group alive. One day, someone in your group finds a clay vessel that was left outside weeks ago. Inside, there's a thick, strange-smelling slurry, grain that got wet from rain, then sat in the heat. Nobody planned this. Nobody wrote it down or thought through the chemistry. But someone, for some reason, hunger, curiosity, maybe just because nothing was ever thrown away, takes a drink. And then something changes. Not immediately dangerous. Not painful. Just different. A warmth behind the sternum. A loosening of the jaw. The world, still hard, still cold, still uncertain, feels somehow lighter. That moment right there, that accidental, slightly gross, slightly bewildering moment, that might be one of the most consequential things that ever happened to the human species. Here's the thing that catches most people off guard when they learn about the actual history of alcohol. It did not begin as a leisure activity. Nobody in the ancient world sat around thinking, you know what would be a great way to unwind? The origin of fermented drinks is messier, stranger, and far more deeply woven into the fabric of human survival than the clean story we usually tell. What this video is really about isn't booze. It's about what the invention of fermented drinks reveals about the way humans solve problems, and how some of the most transformative technologies in history started not with intention, but with observation and accident, shaped by desperation and biology. We are going to move through 4 specific ideas. First, what actually happened chemically, and why the human body was primed for this interaction long before anyone planned it. Second, the real archaeological evidence that rewrites the timeline we learned in school. Third, the deeply strange theory that alcohol didn't follow civilization. It may have helped create it. And fourth, the part that complicates all the triumphalism. The fact that not every group on Earth had the same relationship to fermentation, and why that matters more than we usually admit. By the end, the next time you crack open any fermented drink, beer, wine, kombucha, whatever, you're going to see it differently. Let's start with biology, because the story of ancient humans discovering alcohol only makes sense if you understand why our bodies were ready for it. Every piece of ripe fruit on Earth contains sugar. When that fruit is exposed to wild yeast, which is simply floating through the air around you right now, on every surface, everywhere, those sugars begin converting to ethanol and carbon dioxide. This is fermentation, and it requires no human intervention whatsoever. It has been happening on this planet for hundreds of millions of years. Long before Homo sapiens existed, primates were almost certainly eating overripe, naturally fermented fruit on a regular basis. Robert Dudley, a biologist at UC Berkeley, laid out what he calls the drunken monkey hypothesis around 2004, and while the name is playful, the argument is serious. Dudley's point is that our primate ancestors evolved a specific genetic capacity to metabolize ethanol efficiently because the fruit most loaded with calories, the fully ripe and fermenting fruit, also happened to contain the most alcohol. The individuals who could process it without dying passed on that metabolic trait. By the time modern humans arrived, we were already genetically configured to handle ethanol at low to moderate levels. We didn't just stumble into a random chemical. We stumbled into something our bodies had been quietly preparing for over millions of years. There's even a specific enzyme at the center of this story, alcohol dehydrogenase, or ADH4, which, in human ancestors, mutated roughly 10 million years ago into a version 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol than the version found in other primates. 40 times. That's not a small upgrade. Matthew Kerrigan and colleagues published this finding in 2015 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and what it tells us is that by the time our hominin ancestors were walking upright on the African savanna, the metabolic machinery to handle fermented food was already built in. So when ancient humans first encountered naturally fermented grain or fruit, they weren't doing something totally foreign to their biology. They were doing something their bodies recognized at a cellular level. That's the first piece of the puzzle, and it changes how we think about discovery. Now let's talk about what the ground actually tells us, because the archaeological record on this is both older and weirder than most people expect. The place to start is Jiahu, a Neolithic site in the Hunan province of China. In 2004, Patrick McGovern, a biomolecular archaeologist at the University of Pennsylvania, who has probably done more to trace ancient alcohol than anyone alive, analyzed residue scraped from pottery shards at Jiahu, dated to around 7000 BC. What he found was a mixed fermented beverage: rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, all fermented together into something that doesn't really have a clean modern equivalent. This is not beer as we know it, not wine. It's something older and stranger, a deliberate, intentional brew from nearly 9,000 years ago. But Jiahu wasn't even the oldest site McGovern has worked on. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, the site that famously shattered the assumption that organized construction came after settled agriculture, there is evidence of large stone vessels, some capable of holding up to 160 liters, that appear to have been used for communal brewing of some kind of grain-based fermented liquid. Göbekli Tepe dates to roughly 10,000 BCE. The people who built those elaborate carved stone pillars were, according to some researchers, not yet fully agricultural. They were at the cusp, and they may have been brewing. Which brings us to the most destabilizing idea in this entire story. There's a theory that has been circulating among archaeologists for decades, quietly, because it overturns one of the most foundational narratives in the study of civilization. The standard sequence we all learned goes: humans settle down, grow grain for food, develop surplus, develop complexity, and eventually, as a kind of luxury development, start brewing. Alcohol follows agriculture. Civilization first, fermentation second. Brian Hayden, an archaeologist at Simon Fraser University, spent years building the case for almost the exact reverse. His argument, laid out extensively in his 2009 paper, "The Proof is in the Pudding," is that the motivation to grow grain in the first place may have been tied directly to producing fermented beverages, not staple food. The evidence he points to includes the fact that early domesticated grains were not particularly efficient food sources in their raw state, but they were excellent for brewing. The caloric argument for early agriculture, when you examine it carefully, has gaps. The social argument, that brewing enabled feasting, and feasting cemented political alliances and social hierarchies, is, according to Hayden, far more compelling. This isn't a fringe idea anymore. Archaeologist Patrick McGovern has expressed sympathy with versions of this argument. Andrew Sherrod, one of the 20th century's more influential archaeologists before his death in 2006, called psychoactive substances the original goods around which complex trade networks organized themselves. The economist and historian Gregory Clark has noted that in many early societies, fermented grain drinks were safer to consume than local water. The fermentation process kills pathogens, which means that populations who drank fermented beverages may have had genuine survival advantages over those who didn't. Think about what this means. The path from nomadic forager to settled farmer to city builder, the entire arc of what we call civilization, may have had fermented drinks not as a byproduct, but as a catalyst. A reason, maybe even the reason some groups began planting grain in the first place. That's not a comfortable idea if you're attached to the notion that practical food necessity drove everything. But the evidence keeps pointing in this direction, and there's something almost philosophically satisfying about it, in a dark way. Humans didn't build complex societies because they were rational optimizers following the most efficient caloric path. They built them, at least in part, because they wanted to get together and drink something that made the world feel bearable. That sounds much more like us. Here's where we have to slow down and push back on our own enthusiasm, because the triumphalist version of this story, alcohol invented civilization, isn't that wild. Papers over something important. The capacity to ferment grain is not universal, and neither is the metabolic capacity to process the results. The ADH4 mutation we discussed earlier, the one that made ethanol metabolism efficient in our ancestors, was not distributed equally across all human populations during their subsequent migrations and divergences. Roughly 35 to 40% of people with East Asian ancestry carry a variant of the ELDH2 gene that causes a significantly different reaction to ethanol: flushing, nausea, elevated heart rate. The so-called Asian flush is not a trivial social inconvenience. It's a biochemical signal that the metabolic pathway for processing alcohol is operating differently. And when European contact brought distilled spirits and high-alcohol fermented beverages to populations in the Americas, Australia, and parts of Africa that had been isolated from the long history of alcohol-producing cultures, the results were catastrophic in ways that don't reduce to simple explanations. The argument that some populations simply couldn't handle alcohol is now largely discredited as a biological claim. But researchers like Joseph Wittick and Kathleen Grant have noted that differential exposure history, different fermentation traditions, and different metabolic profiles all contributed to profoundly unequal outcomes when distilled spirits entered the picture in the colonial period. The ancient story of fermented drinks is genuinely one of ingenuity, accidental discovery, and profound social utility. But the modern inheritance of that story includes addiction, colonial exploitation, and public health crises that are still playing out. To tell the ancient part without acknowledging the modern part is to do what bad history always does: stop the story exactly when it gets morally inconvenient. The same technology that may have helped stitch together early human communities also became a tool of social disruption, deliberate and otherwise. That complexity doesn't make the ancient story less remarkable. It just makes it more honest. So where does this leave us? Let's pull the threads together. Somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago, possibly earlier, a group of humans noticed that wet grain left in a vessel changed over time. It smelled different. It tasted different. And when they drank it, something in their nervous system responded in a way that felt, for lack of a better word, meaningful. They didn't know about yeast. They didn't know about enzymes or fermentation chemistry or any of the mechanisms that we can describe today. What they knew is that this substance did something, and they figured out how to do it again. That's the core loop of human technological development. Observe an effect, attempt to reproduce it, refine the reproduction. We ran that same loop to get fire under reliable control, to domesticate animals, to build the first irrigation channels. The fact that one of the earliest and most consequential applications of that loop was making something that altered consciousness, that says something about us, about what we prioritize, about what makes the effort of living feel worth the effort. And here is the insight that I keep coming back to. The ancient brewers weren't being irrational or escapist. They were solving a real problem. The problem of social cohesion. How do you get a group of stressed, competing, sometimes hostile individuals to trust each other enough to cooperate? You create a shared ritual, a shared substance, a shared altered state that lowers defenses, opens communication, signals mutual vulnerability. The feast was a technology. The drink was a technology. And whoever controlled that technology controlled something far more valuable than calories. Modern neuroscience knows that alcohol at moderate levels causes the brain to release oxytocin, the same hormone associated with bonding, trust, and social affiliation. Our ancient ancestors had no concept of oxytocin. They just noticed that drinking together made people act more like a community and less like strangers. The mechanism wasn't understood. The effect was unmistakable. Every civilization you can name has left behind some evidence of fermented drink production. The Egyptians brewed beer industrially and paid workers partly in grain and partly in beer ration. The Sumerians had a dedicated goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, and the hymn to Ninkasi, dated to roughly 1800 BCE, is both a religious text and, remarkably, a detailed brewing recipe. The ancient Greeks theorized about wine philosophically. Indigenous communities across every inhabited continent developed their own fermentation traditions. Chicha from maize in the Andes, pulque from agave in Mesoamerica, tejuino, kvass, mead made from honey that predates grape wine in many regions. This near-universal convergence isn't coincidence. It's not a quirk of cultural diffusion. It's what happens when a species with a particular neurochemistry, living in groups that depend on social trust, discovers a technology that makes trust easier to produce. Of course they all found it. Of course they all kept it. The ones who didn't were probably outcompeted by the ones who did. Which brings us back to that clay vessel outside the settlement near what is now Turkey 10,000 years ago. The person who picked it up and drank didn't know they were participating in the beginning of something. They were just curious or hungry or bold enough to try. But that moment of willingness, that readiness to engage with something unfamiliar, To notice an effect and wonder about it is the same cognitive posture behind every significant human discovery since. The ancient world didn't lack for knowledge. It lacked only the opportunities to stumble into it. We are the descendants of the people who drank from the weird jar. If you made it this far, you already know you're the kind of person who doesn't just want the surface layer of things. The Before 1000 channel exists for exactly that. For the people who want to know not just what happened, but what it meant and what it still means for the way we live now. If that's the kind of thinking you want more of, subscribe and leave a comment below. What does it say about a civilization, you think, that one of its first technological innovations was something that changed how the mind worked? Because I have a strong opinion on that, and I suspect you might too.